They called Adrian Wolf untouchable. The kind of man who never raised his voice because he never needed to. Deals closed when he entered a room. Arguments ended when he looked up. At Wolf Consortium, silence wasn't awkward. It was obedience. That morning, on the 48th floor, Adrian Wolf didn't want conflict. He wanted efficiency. The boardroom was sealed in glass and steel, high above Manhattan. Executives sat polished and confident, laptops open, voices sharp with ambition. A hostile acquisition was minutes away from approval. Billions on the line. Then someone spoke who wasn't supposed to. "Excuse me," a quiet voice said from the far end of the table. No one looked. Mira Cole sat with her hands folded neatly in front of her tablet, posture straight, expression neutral. Junior analyst. Third seat from the wall. No nameplate worth reading. The kind of employee people talked over without noticing. She tried again. "There's an inconsistency in the financial model." A senior vice president cut her off without turning his head. "We've already reviewed that." Another executive sighed, irritated. "Let's stay focused." Mira fell silent. Across the table, someone chuckled softly. Comment followed. Measured, dismissive. "If there's a problem, it should have been caught earlier." Eyes shifted, not toward the data but toward her. The implication landed clean and sharp. This was her fault. Adrian Wolf watched it all without expression, his fingers resting calmly on the edge of the table. He didn't intervene. He didn't correct them. He didn't speak. The room moved on. They thought Mira would do what she always did. Lower her gaze. Take the blame. Disappear. What they didn't know, what none of them bothered to ask, was that Mira Cole had spent 3 nights rerunning the numbers. That she had traced the discrepancy back to a deliberate alteration. That approving this deal wouldn't just cost money. It would destroy hundreds of jobs and bury the truth permanently. Her heart pounded. Her instincts screamed at her to stay quiet. But something heavier pressed against her chest. Mira pushed her chair back and stood. The sound was small, but in that room it was thunder. "I need 30 seconds, she said. Not loud. Not shaking. Just steady. Few people laughed. Someone started to object. That was when Adrian Wolf raised his hand. The room stopped. Every voice died mid-sentence. Every screen froze. Every eye turned, not to Mira, but to him. Adrian Wolf finally looked directly at her. "Let her speak," he said. And for the first time that morning, power shifted. Adrian Wolf had built his authority without spectacle. He didn't slam doors or threaten livelihoods aloud. He didn't need to. His power lived in the way conversations bent toward him, in how executives adjusted their posture when he entered a room, in the unspoken understanding that nothing important happened at Wolf Consortium unless it passed through his hands first. He sat at the head of the table now, jacket perfectly tailored, tie loosened just enough to suggest long hours rather than comfort. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the city behind him. Steel, glass, motion. Manhattan looked smaller from this height, reduced to patterns and grids. That was how Adrian Wolf saw the world. Systems to be studied, pressure points to be applied, outcomes to be controlled. The boardroom was full, but no one mistook that for equality. On one side sat senior partners with equity stakes and private agendas. On the other, legal counsel, finance heads, consultants flown in overnight. Each voice had its rank. Each interruption was calculated. Words were chosen carefully, not to be right, but to be aligned. Adrian listened. He always did. A vice president was speaking now, outlining the final steps of the acquisition. Clean slides, confident numbers, rehearsed certainty. It was a hostile move dressed up as opportunity. Acquire. Restructure. Cut redundancies. Sell the narrative. The usual language of corporate conquest. Adrian's gaze drifted not to the speaker, but around the table. He watched tells the way other men watched faces at poker tables. Tightening jaw. A hand that lingered too long on a pen. Someone speaking too quickly to get ahead of doubt. These rooms taught you who people really were if you paid attention. Most didn't pay attention. They spoke to be heard. They postured to be remembered. Adrian had learned early that interruption was the loudest form of insecurity. The men who talked over others were rarely the ones in control. Real authority didn't rush. It waited. It let people expose themselves. That was why the silence mattered. When he didn't speak, it unsettled them. When he let discussions spiral without correction, it forced mistakes to surface. Entire careers had stalled because Adrian Wolf simply leaned back and said nothing at all. He noticed Mira Cole the way one notices a change in air pressure. Subtle, instinctive. She sat far from him, near the edge of the table, tablet aligned perfectly with the wood grain, hands folded. She hadn't spoken since the meeting began. That wasn't unusual. Junior analysts rarely did. But there was something precise about her stillness. Not nervous, not disengaged, waiting. He'd seen that posture before. In junior traders who survived crashes. In engineers who noticed flaws long before failures went public. The vice president concluded, smiling as if the outcome were already sealed. Few executives nodded. Someone murmured approval. Legal counsel began flipping to the next page. Adrian didn't move. The room hesitated just for a fraction of a second, then continued anyway, momentum carrying it forward. That too was part of the battlefield. People filled silence when they were afraid of it. When the quiet voice came from the far end of the table, it didn't challenge him. It didn't disrupt the flow aggressively. Simply existed. "Excuse me." Adrian felt the ripple before it reached him. Slight shift. An interruption too small to be acknowledged properly. He watched as it was dismissed. Not cruelly. Not loudly. Just efficiently. The machine kept moving. That was how power usually crushed things, without noticing. Adrian folded his hands together, eyes steady, expression unreadable. He let it happen. Not because he agreed. Not because he approved. But because moments like this revealed far more than speeches ever could. And as the room continued, confident in its assumptions, Adrian Wolf made a quiet note to himself. This meeting was not going the way they thought it was. Not even close. Mira Cole had learned early that being unnoticed was not the same as being invisible. Invisible meant absent. Unnoticed meant present, and ignored. She had been present in this building for 3 years. She arrived before most of the floor lights turned on, coffee cooling beside her keyboard as spreadsheets loaded. She stayed after the elevators thinned out, running scenarios again and again until the numbers stopped shifting under her eyes. Wolf Consortium rewarded certainty, not curiosity, so she learned to be careful with both. Her desk sat near the interior wall of the analytics department, close enough to hear conversations but far enough to never be pulled into them. She didn't decorate it. No photos. No plants. Just a tablet, a notebook, and a pen she replaced too often because she pressed too hard when she thought. People knew her name only when something needed checking. "Mira, can you verify this? Mira, does this align? Mira, just confirm before we send." She confirmed. She aligned. She verified. What they didn't do was ask what she thought. That was fine, she told herself. Thinking was safer than speaking. Thinking didn't draw attention. Thinking didn't make enemies. She'd seen what happened to people who challenged the room too loudly. How they were slowly excluded, sidelined, labeled difficult. Mira had student loans that still felt like a weight on her chest. A mother who called every Sunday and asked if she was eating properly. A quiet apartment she couldn't afford to lose. So she stayed small. But small didn't mean careless. 3 nights earlier, she'd been the last one left on her floor when the preliminary acquisition model landed in her inbox. Routine review. That was the label. She almost closed it without looking deeper. Almost. Something didn't balance. It wasn't obvious. The numbers worked if you skimmed. They always did. But when Mira rebuilt the model from the raw inputs, the discrepancy appeared. Tiny at first, then undeniable. A liability shifted just enough to pass review thresholds. A cost deferred into a later quarter where it wouldn't trigger alarms. Deliberate. He checked again. And again. By the second hour, the city outside her window had gone dark. By the third, she was certain. This deal would gut an entire division within 18 months. Jobs would vanish quietly. Contracts would be broken legally. Blame would land nowhere it could be fought. She drafted an email. Deleted it. Drafted another. Deleted that too. Emails lived forever. And emails could be ignored. She told herself she'd bring it up in the meeting. If there was time. If it made sense. If she could phrase it carefully enough. Now, sitting in the boardroom, that careful plan was unraveling. She felt it the moment the conversation shifted toward her. Subtle, polite, lethal. The way blame slid across the table without ever being spoken directly. The way eyes flicked to her and then away. She kept her expression neutral. She'd practiced that in the mirror once years ago. Calm face. Steady breath. Don't react. Her instinct was to retreat. To let it pass. To clean up later, quietly, the way she always did. But this time later would be too late. The room was moving toward a decision that couldn't be undone once announced. Legal counsel was already preparing language. The vice president was smiling again. Mira's fingers tightened around her pen. She thought of the division she'd started her career in. The people who'd trained her, who'd trusted the numbers she ran. She thought of the emails she'd received last year, thanking her for catching smaller errors before they became problems. She thought of how tired she was of being right in silence. When she spoke, the words felt fragile as they left her mouth. Not because they were weak, but because she knew how easily they could be crushed. And when the room moved on without her, when the dismissal came soft and efficient, something inside her shifted. She didn't feel angry. She felt clear. As she pushed her chair back, the sound barely registered. But to Mira, it was the loudest thing she'd ever done. She stood not because she was fearless. She stood because staying seated had finally become unbearable. The deal had been in motion for months, quietly gathering momentum long before it reached the boardroom. On paper it was clean, elegant even. A struggling logistics firm absorbed by Wolf Consortium, its inefficiencies trimmed, its assets folded neatly into a larger machine. The press release was already drafted in someone's inbox. Words like synergy, growth, strategic alignment waiting to be released into the world. In the room, it was being framed as inevitable. Slides advanced with practiced rhythm. Charts rose and fell in reassuring colors. The vice president walked them through the timeline as if there were no alternatives left to consider, only steps to complete. Heads nodded. Pens scratched brief notes that would never be read again. Mira watched the numbers move past. Each one familiar. Too familiar. She had rebuilt them line by line in the quiet hours of the night, stripped of commentary and confident voices. In isolation, the model told a different story. Not catastrophic. Not reckless. Just wrong in a way that mattered. The liability shift was still there, buried in the assumptions. A small change in depreciation. A delayed recognition of costs. Nothing illegal on its own. Together, it formed a pattern, one that made the acquisition appear safer than it was. It wasn't a mistake. Someone had wanted this deal approved quickly, quietly, before the long-term consequences surfaced. The discussion turned to risk mitigation. Legal counsel spoke now, calm and precise, outlining protections that sounded comprehensive but relied on the same distorted projections. Every safeguard leaned on data Mira knew had been touched. She glanced down at her tablet, thumb hovering over the file she'd prepared. Screenshots, timestamps, version histories that told a story no one else in the room seemed interested in hearing. Across the table, an executive laughed lightly. "We've been over this. The exposure is minimal." Minimal for whom, Mira thought. For the shareholders, maybe. For the executives who would collect bonuses before the fallout. Not for the employees whose division would quietly dissolve when the numbers corrected themselves. Her gaze drifted, just briefly, to Adrian Wolf. He was listening. Always listening. His attention seemed divided, but she had the sense he was tracking more than the words being spoken. He hadn't endorsed the deal yet. He hadn't stopped it either. That uncertainty hung in the air, unacknowledged. The vice president reached the final slide. Pending approval, we'll move forward immediately. This was the moment. Mira felt it settle in her chest, heavy and unmistakable. Once this passed, the narrative would harden. Questions would become inconvenient. Data would be retrofitted to justify decisions already made. She had been telling herself that someone else would catch it. That internal audits existed for a reason. That the system would correct itself. But systems only corrected what they were allowed to see. She shifted in her chair, pulse quickening. The words formed carefully in her mind. Not accusatory, not emotional. Just factual. Just enough to slow them down. Before we approve, she began. The interruption came quickly. Smooth as a practiced reflex. We don't need to reopen the model, someone said. Not unkindly. Just firmly. Another voice followed. If there were an issue, it would have surfaced during review. Mira's throat tightened. That was the lie of it. The review process hadn't failed. Had been guided. The conversation rolled forward. Her words absorbed and dismissed in the same breath. A decision approaching with the weight of consensus behind it. She could feel herself receding again, the familiar pull toward silence. Toward letting it happen and telling herself she had done what she could. But she hadn't. Not really. The deal shouldn't happen. Not like this. Not built on numbers that told only part of the truth. Mira straightened, her heartbeat loud in her ears. If she stayed quiet now, she would be complicit. And that was a cost she hadn't calculated for, but knew she couldn't afford. The shift was subtle at first. A pause that lingered a second too long. A glance exchanged across the table that didn't include her. Mira felt it before it fully formed. The way pressure in the room changed direction, searching for somewhere softer to land. The vice president cleared his throat. If there's concern about the model, he said lightly, it likely stems from the junior level inputs. Junior level. The phrase was delivered without heat, almost kindly, as if offering an explanation rather than an accusation. Heads turned, not sharply, not all at once, but enough. Enough to make the shape of it clear. Mira. Someone else nodded, relieved. Right. Those assumptions come from analytics. Another voice followed, smoother, practiced. And that's under Mira's scope, correct? It wasn't a question. It was a narrowing. Mira felt the warmth drain from her hands. Her mouth went dry, but her expression stayed neutral. She had learned that much. Reacting made things worse. Reacting gave them something to push against. Yes, she said quietly. Analytics provides the initial framework. The vice president smiled, grateful. There we go. Then we're aligned. Aligned. The word landed heavier than any accusation. The implication was clean and devastating. If there was a problem, it belonged to her. If the numbers failed later, the failure would have a name attached, and it wouldn't be theirs. Mira looked down at her tablet. The evidence sat there, patient and damning. Version histories showing edits made after her submission. Adjustments logged under senior credentials. A trail she hadn't wanted to believe mattered until now. She could feel the room closing ranks. No one asked her to explain. No one asked what she'd found. The conversation simply moved on, built on the assumption that the issue had been identified and neatly contained. Contained in her. She thought of all the time she'd fixed errors quietly, sending corrections without comment so others wouldn't look careless. Of the late nights she'd spent double-checking work that would be presented by someone else in the morning. That goodwill evaporated quickly. The legal counsel leaned forward. If analytics has confirmed the risk is acceptable, then we're clear to proceed. Mira's pulse thudded in her ears. Acceptable. She hadn't said that. She hadn't even implied it. She looked up, meeting eyes around the table. Most slid away. A few held hers briefly, uncomfortable but unwilling. One or two looked almost apologetic. Adrian Wolf said nothing. That was the hardest part. His silence wasn't approval, but it wasn't protection either. It left space for the narrative to settle, to harden into something official. The vice president continued. We all trust Mira's work. She's thorough. The praise felt like a blade wrapped in velvet. Mira inhaled slowly. She could feel the old instinct urging her to accept it. Nod. To let the moment pass and fix what she could later, in the shadows. But later there would be no later. The deal would close. The announcement would go out. And when the consequences surfaced, her name would already be attached to the assumptions that made them inevitable. Her chest tightened, not with fear this time, but with a sharp, steady resolve. She realized with surprising clarity that the room had already decided who she was. Useful, quiet, expendable. If she didn't speak now, she would be agreeing with them. Mira placed her pen down carefully, aligning it with the edge of the table. The small act grounded her, gave her a second to breathe. She pushed her chair back. The sound cut through the murmurs, not loud, not dramatic, but enough. Enough to fracture the moment they thought they'd secured. As she stood, the vice president turned toward her, brows lifting in mild surprise. Mira. She met his gaze, then looked past him, down the length of the table. I need to clarify something, she said. Her voice was steady, not defensive, not apologetic, just honest. And for the first time since the meeting began, the room didn't quite know what to do with her. For a heartbeat, no one answered her. The meeting had not been designed to accommodate resistance, especially not from someone like Mira. The silence that followed her words was thin, uncertain, as if the room itself were checking whether it had misheard. I just want to be precise, she continued, before anyone could interrupt again. Her hands were steady at her sides. She made sure of that. Because what's being attributed to analytics isn't accurate. A few heads lifted. Others stiffened. The vice president's smile tightened. Mira, we're already behind schedule. I know, she said evenly. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't rush. That's why I need 30 seconds. 30 seconds. Not a challenge. Not a plea. Boundary. Someone exhaled sharply, irritated. Another executive shifted in his seat, glancing toward Adrian Wolf as if expecting him to intervene. He didn't. The room waited just long enough. Mira tapped her tablet once, and the screen at the center of the table changed. Not to the polished slides they'd been reviewing, but to a clean, stripped-down interface. Rows of numbers. Timestamps. Revision logs. This is the version of the model analytics submitted, she said. Monday night. You'll see the assumptions flagged in yellow. Those were conservative by design. She paused, letting them orient themselves. Tuesday morning, she continued. Those assumptions were altered. Depreciation schedules adjusted. Deferred costs shifted into Q4. A murmur rippled through the room, low and unsettled. She didn't look at anyone in particular as she spoke. She focused on the facts, the way she always did when the numbers felt overwhelming. One line at a time. One truth after another. These changes weren't made by my team, she said. They were introduced after review, under senior credentials. The vice president leaned forward now, expression sharp. Are you implying? I'm stating, Mira said gently, that the current risk profile is based on modified data. And if the deal proceeds under these assumptions, the division marked non-core will collapse within 18 months. The words landed heavier than she expected. Not because they were dramatic, but because they were calm. She saw it then. The shift from dismissal to concern. From irritation to calculation. Legal counsel frowned, already scrolling through documents. Someone whispered to their neighbor. A pen clattered softly to the table. Mira felt the adrenaline surge, hot and dizzying. She forced herself to slow down. I should have escalated sooner, she said. That part is on me. But blaming analytics won't change the outcome. Approving this deal as it stands will cost people their jobs and expose the company to litigation we won't be able to contain. Silence. Not the polite kind this time. The kind that meant something had cracked. She finally looked toward Adrian Wolf. He was watching her with an intensity that made her pulse stumble. Not angry, not approving. Assessing. She finished before doubt could creep in. "That's all," she said. "Thank you for the 30 seconds. She didn't sit back down. She stayed standing, heart racing, breath shallow, waiting for the consequences she had spent years trying to avoid. For a moment no one spoke. Then Adrian Wolf raised his hand. It wasn't dramatic. No sharp motion. Just a simple, controlled gesture. But it stopped everything. "Hold," he said. Every conversation died instantly. Every screen froze where it was. Eyes turned toward him, then back to Mira, as if seeing her clearly for the first time. Adrian leaned forward slightly, elbows resting on the table. "Send me the original file," he said to her. His voice was calm, unreadable. "And the revision history." Mira nodded, fingers moving automatically. Adrian's gaze swept the room. "No one leaves," he said. "We're going to take this apart properly." He looked back at Mira. "And this time," he added, "no one interrupts her." In that moment the fear didn't vanish, but it loosened its grip. Mira realized she was still standing. And for the first time she didn't feel alone. The effect was immediate. Screens went dark one by one as hands stilled mid-scroll. Conversations that had begun to rise instinctively cut off, unfinished, abandoned. Even the ambient hum of the building seemed to fade, as if the floor itself had learned when to hold its breath. Adrian Wolf did not raise his voice. He didn't need to. He remained seated, posture relaxed, hands folded loosely in front of him. But the atmosphere in the room shifted around that stillness, reorganizing itself the way iron filings align around a magnet. Power settled where it had always belonged. "No one leaves," he repeated, not louder, just final. A few executives glanced at one another, uncertainty flickering across faces that were usually so composed. One of them reached for his phone, then stopped when Adrian's gaze landed on him. The phone stayed on the table. Adrian turned his attention back to Mira. "Walk us through it," he said. "From the beginning. Assume nothing." The invitation was precise. Not a defense. Not a favor. An instruction. Mira swallowed once, then nodded. She stepped closer to the table, close enough now that the screens reflected faintly in her eyes. She sent the files, and the central display came back to life, this time under her control. As she spoke, Adrian watched the room. He watched the vice president's jaw tighten as the revision timestamps appeared. He watched legal counsel's expression shift from irritation to concern as liabilities re-emerged where they'd been carefully buried. He watched the quiet panic set in. Not loud, not dramatic, but unmistakable. This was the part most people missed. The moment after confidence breaks, when fear hasn't yet found its voice. Adrian lived in that space. "Pause there," he said softly as Mira highlighted a line item. She did immediately. He leaned forward, eyes narrowing slightly as he studied the numbers. He didn't ask questions for show. When he spoke, it was surgical. "These assumptions," he said, tapping the screen. "Who approved them?" No one answered. He waited. The vice president cleared his throat. "They were refined during senior review." Adrian didn't look at him. "By whom?" Another pause. Longer this time. "Answer the question," Adrian said. A name was offered. Then another. The web began to surface. Adrian leaned back, absorbing it all without reaction. The room waited for the outburst that never came. "Thank you," he said finally. The words carried weight. Not gratitude, but acknowledgement. He turned to Mira again. "You did your job," he said. "And you did it thoroughly." It wasn't praise. It was validation. In this room that mattered more. He stood then, slowly, buttoning his jacket with unhurried precision. Chairs shifted as people instinctively straightened, bracing themselves. "This meeting is no longer about acquisition," Adrian said. "It's about integrity." The word landed hard. "Any decision based on altered data is void," he continued. "Effective immediately." A ripple moved through the room, quiet, stunned. He looked toward legal counsel. Prepare a full internal review. I want every revision traced. Then to the vice president. You're off this deal. The vice president opened his mouth, then thought better of it. Adrian's gaze swept the table one last time. Let me be very clear, he said. Silencing competence is not strategy. It's negligence. He turned back to Mira. You will stay, he said. You will assist the review. And you will speak when something doesn't align, without asking permission. Mira nodded, her chest tight, her thoughts racing. The room felt different now. Not safer but honest. Adrian took his seat again. Now, he said, calm as ever. We continue. And no one dared to interrupt. The truth did not arrive all at once. It surfaced in fragments. Quiet, undeniable, impossible to dismiss once seen. Mira guided the room through the data with careful precision. Her voice steady as the screens filled with timelines and revision paths. Each change told a story. Not dramatic, not chaotic, just deliberate. Someone had known exactly where to apply pressure so the numbers would bend without breaking. Legal counsel asked questions now, no longer performative. Their tone had changed. Less defensive, more exacting. Compliance officers took notes they hadn't planned to take. Names that had once carried authority were suddenly weighed differently. Adrian Wolf said nothing. He let the unraveling do its work. This revision, Mira said, highlighting a column, was made 40 minutes after analytics submitted the final model. It lowered projected exposure just enough to pass the approval threshold. A partner leaned forward, frowning. That adjustment wasn't disclosed. No, Mira said. It wasn't meant to be. The room grew tense. A quiet kind of tension, where people stopped shifting in their seats and started calculating consequences instead. One executive tried to regain footing. These kinds of refinements happen all the time. Let's not pretend. Adrian looked at him. The words died in the man's mouth. Refinements are documented, Adrian said calmly. Manipulations are concealed. He turned his attention back to the screen. Continue. Mira did. She didn't rush. She didn't soften the implications. She laid them out the way she always had in her head. Clean, methodical, impossible to argue with. Deferred cost. Internal emails referencing timeline sensitivity. A pattern of urgency that had nothing to do with strategy and everything to do with timing bonuses before quarter close. As the picture sharpened, so did the reactions. A senior partner's confidence slipped into agitation. Another avoided eye contact entirely. Someone asked for a break, then thought better of it. The lies didn't explode. They collapsed. One by one, explanations thinned under scrutiny. Statements contradicted each other. Silence replaced bravado. The version of events they'd arrived with could no longer survive in the open. Mira felt strangely detached as it happened, like she was watching something she'd already processed days ago. The fear that had driven her to stand was gone now, replaced by a clear, almost sobering awareness of what truth actually did when it was allowed to exist. Adrian finally spoke again. This deal was never about efficiency, he said. It was about speed. He glanced around the table. Speed hides a lot of things. But it also leaves traces. He looked toward Mira. You saw them. It wasn't a question. She nodded. Adrian turned back to the room. Anyone else who saw this and chose not to speak should consider that choice carefully. No one responded. The room felt exposed now, stripped of performance. The glass walls no longer felt like prestige. They felt like transparency. Legal counsel closed her laptop slowly. We'll need to disclose this to the board, she said. And suspend all acquisition activity until the review is complete. Adrian inclined his head once. Do it. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't threaten. He didn't need to. Authority moved with him effortlessly, rearranging priorities as it went. Mira realized then that something irreversible had happened. Not just to the deal. The assumptions that had governed this room, The ones about who mattered, who spoke, who was safe to ignore, had cracked beyond repair. As the last slide faded from the screen, Adrian looked at her again. His expression was unreadable, but there was something else there now. Not curiosity, not surprise, recognition. The truth was no longer buried. It was on the table, and no one could pretend they hadn't seen it. The aftermath was quieter than Mira expected. There were no raised voices, no dramatic exits. Just a steady recalibration, as if the room itself were being reprogrammed in real time. Authority shifted without ceremony. Influence drained from some seats and settled into others. Adrian Wolf orchestrated it with surgical calm. "Compliance will take custody of all related files," he said, already moving on. "Access is restricted effective immediately." Phones lit up as messages were sent. Permissions changed. Calendars were wiped clean. The deal that had seemed inevitable an hour ago dissolved into a series of cancellations and redacted memos. The vice president who had spoken most confidently earlier sat very still now, hands folded, eyes fixed on the table. When Adrian addressed him, it was without heat. "You'll step away from leadership duties pending review," Adrian said. "Effective now." The man nodded once, as if relieved the moment had finally arrived. Another executive attempted a careful defense, procedural, polished, but Adrian stopped him with a look before the first sentence finished forming. "This isn't a debate," he said. "It's an outcome." That was when Mira understood the difference between influence and power. Influence argued. Power decided. Adrian turned to legal counsel. "Ensure that every employee impacted by this halted acquisition is notified today. No uncertainty. No rumors." "Of course," she replied. "And severance protections for any department previously flagged as non-core," he added. "They're not collateral." Mira felt something loosen in her chest at that word. Collateral. It was what the numbers had tried to turn people into. Adrian continued, addressing the room without raising his voice. "This company does not grow by sacrificing its own credibility. Anyone who thought otherwise miscalculated." No one challenged him. The guilty didn't fall dramatically. They simply lost gravity. Their authority evaporated. Their voices receded. By the time the meeting began to adjourn, their presence felt provisional, temporary in a way it hadn't an hour earlier. Mira stayed where she was, hands clasped loosely now, heart finally slowing. The fear that had fueled her courage was gone, replaced by a strange stillness. Adrian looked at her once more. "You'll report directly to my office for the duration of the review," he said. "Not as support. As lead analyst." A few heads turned sharply. Mira nodded, surprised by how natural the motion felt. "Yes," she said. There was no applause. No congratulation. Just acceptance. In this room that was enough. As people gathered their things, the mood had changed entirely. Conversations were quieter, careful, respectful in a way Mira hadn't experienced before. Not because she demanded it, but because it had been established. She realized she was no longer being watched as a risk. She was being watched as a reference point. Adrian waited until the room was nearly empty before speaking again. "You didn't protect yourself," he said. "You protected the company." Mira met his gaze. "I protected the truth." Then the smallest hint of approval crossed his expression. "That," he said, "is power when it's used correctly." He turned away, already moving on to the next decision, the next pressure point. But something fundamental had shifted. The innocent were no longer exposed. And the room would never operate the same way again. The corridor outside the boardroom felt different as Mira stepped into it. Not brighter. Not quieter. Just altered in a way she could feel in her posture, in the way her shoulders settled instead of curling inward. The glass walls reflected her back at herself. Composed, steady, unmistakably present. People passed her and nodded. Some did it carefully, as if unsure of the rules. Others did it with a frank respect that hadn't existed before. No one pretended not to see her. She walked past the analytics floor where she had spent so many hours unnoticed, past the desk that had once felt like a safe corner. A few colleagues looked up as she passed. One smiled. Another lifted a hand in acknowledgement. A third simply watched, thoughtful, as if recalibrating something long assumed. Mira paused at her desk only long enough to close her tablet and slide her notebook into her bag. The space looked smaller than it had that morning. Not inadequate, just no longer defining. Her phone vibrated. A message from compliance confirming next steps. Another from HR, brief and formal. A calendar invite from Adrian Wolf's office. Direct, unambiguous. Lead analyst. Review committee. She let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. In the elevator, she stood alone as it descended, the city rising to meet her through the glass. For a moment, the adrenaline ebbed, leaving behind a quiet fatigue that felt earned. Her reflection stared back at her, eyes clear, expression calm. She thought of all the times she had stayed seated, all the moments she had chosen safety over truth because it seemed like the only way to survive. She didn't regret them. They had brought her here. But she understood now that safety and silence were not the same thing. When the doors opened in the lobby, the hum of the building resumed around her. People moved with purpose. Security nodded as she passed. Outside, Manhattan carried on. Cars, voices, the steady pulse of a city that rarely noticed individual transformations. Mira stepped into it anyway. The air felt cooler, sharper, real. She walked a block before stopping, taking in the weight of what had changed. Not her job title, not her proximity to power, but the way she carried herself through the world. No longer bracing, no longer shrinking. She had spoken. She had been heard. And the room had listened. Her phone buzzed again. A message from her mother, sent earlier that morning. Call me when you can. I'm proud of you. Mira smiled, a small private thing. She turned toward the subway, then paused and changed direction, heading instead for the street-level cafe she passed every day but never entered. She ordered coffee without rushing, stood at the counter without checking her watch, and took the cup with both hands. For once, she wasn't hurrying back to prove something. She was already there. As she stepped back onto the sidewalk, blending into the movement of the city, Mira Cole wasn't invisible anymore. She was secure. She was respected. And she was changed, not by power but by the moment she chose not to give it away.